Ambulance Number 10, Personal Letters from the Front, by Leslie Buswell. Editor's Note, August 1916. Some months ago, a few copies of these letters were printed for private distribution under the title of With the American Ambulance Field Service in France. So keen was the interest that they stirred, and so many the requests for them which followed, that permission for their publication and sale in America was subsequently asked of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Paris. The French government, which had conferred upon their author last October the Croix de Guerre for valor, has now given the necessary sanction and approval. The preface and introduction, written for the original edition, have been left here unaltered, as they explain the circumstances to which this book owes its existence. The title only, for brevity's sake, has been changed to Ambulance Number 10. Foreign Affairs, Office of the Minister, Paris, August 14, 1916. Monsieur Berthelot, Ministre Plénipotentiaire, Chef du Cabinet du Ministre des Affaires étrangères, Président du Council, after having read with interest Mr. Leslie Buswell's book, With the American Ambulance Field Service in France, considers that the public sale in the United States of so excellent a record can only prove advantageous, and he desires to state that, in behalf of France, the censor finds nothing to suppress. Signed, Berthelot. Preface. These letters, according to ordinary ethics in such matters, should not, perhaps, be published. They were merely intended as tributes of friendship and remembrance, casually written, in pencil often, at moments between duties, with no thought of their being destined to any further purpose than that distance and absence might count a little less through the pictures they would give of a day's work far away. Excepting that here and there in each letter a few details quite personal have been omitted, and of course the names of places sometimes changed, they are untouched. Their author has had no chance to revise them, nor, it must be confessed, has his consent to their printing been asked. Footnote. This, of course, has now, August 1916, been granted. End footnote. Knowing him, there seemed little likelihood of his believing them worthy of special attention, not at least without a correspondence of persuasion, and much loss of time. Only the exigency of the hour and a conviction of their worth have led me to take this step. If they give to those who may now read as clear a vision as they have given me of the chivalrous work our young American volunteers are doing in France, they will have achieved something. If occasionally some reader, grateful for this proof that our country is contributing so worthy a part to the heroism of today, should feel inspired to do what he is able toward the encouragement and continuation of this work, these letters will have served a high purpose. The knowledge that a possibility so worthwhile would ultimately outweigh with my friend any personal consideration is justification of the liberty taken, and of this book. Perhaps for the time and effort the writer of these records so generously spent for friendship's sake in the midst of hard and hazardous days, he may find recompense in the realization that aside from the pleasure which their coming meant to one who looked for them. They may bring much benefit to the service he so valiantly describes, and through that service to thousands of men and women whose happiness death might otherwise have destroyed. Henry Davis Sleeper, Gloucester, Massachusetts, September 15th, 1915. Introduction. For many years before the war, there existed at Neuilly-sur-Seine, a suburb of Paris, a semi-philanthropic institution supported by Americans and known as the American Hospital. At the outbreak of the war, this institution instantly and naturally became the rallying point for Americans who loved France and wanted to help care for her wounded soldiers. Within a few weeks it was evident, however, that larger quarters must be found. A splendid new school building, which was rapidly nearing completion in the neighborhood, was rented. Its large, well-lighted and well-ventilated rooms were transformed into hospital wards, operating rooms, dormitories, and offices. A multitude of doctors, surgeons, and nurses were brought over from the United States. And thus the American Ambulance Hospital in the Lycée Pasteur, with accommodations for more than 600 wounded soldiers, came into being. Soon the generosity of another American friend of France made possible a second American Ambulance Hospital, and the venerable College of Jouy, located about 30 miles east of Paris, was steam-fitted, electric-lighted, and plumbed, and made over into a hospital for about 200 additional wounded, with distinguished American surgeons in charge. From the outset, it was clear that the saving of soldiers' lives depended quite as much upon the quick transportation of the wounded as upon their surgical treatment, and in September 1914, when the battlefront surged close to Paris, a dozen automobiles given by Americans, hastily extemporized into ambulances, and driven by American volunteers, ran back and forth night and day between the western end of the Marne Valley and Paris. This was the beginning of the American Ambulance Field Service, with which the following letters have to do. During the autumn and winter that followed, many more cars were given and many more young Americans volunteered, and when the battlefront retired from the vicinity of Paris, sections of motor ambulances were detached from the hospitals at Neuilly and Jouy, and became more or less independent units attached to the several French armies, serving the dressing stations and army hospitals within the army zone. Today, more than 100 such ambulances, given and driven by American friends of France, are carrying wounded French soldiers along the very fighting front in Belgium and France. Footnote. There are at present 1916 over 200. End footnote. In Belgium and northern France, where the American Ambulance Field Service has had an important section since the early months of the war, the valiant service rendered during the Second Battle of the Yser, and during the many bombardments from long-range guns in and about Dunkirk, has attracted official recognition from the highest officers in the army. At the time of the prolonged battles in the vicinity of Ypres in May, General Putz wrote that the American section had, by working 5 nights and days without interruption, assured the evacuation of the hospitals in Everdinghe, though under continual shell fire, which covered all of the roads in the neighborhood and even the hospitals themselves. I cannot praise too highly, he added, the courage and devotion of which the men in your section have given evidence, and I ask you to transmit to them my congratulations and my thanks for the great physical effort which they have so generously made and the signal services which they have rendered. In the section of Alsace which France has definitely recovered from Germany, the American Ambulance Field Service has now the only automobile ambulances, and they are performing a service which no other automobile ambulances could perform. Because of the lightness and power of our little cars, and because we are willing to use them up in this service and replace them without restrictions, our ambulances are running over steep mountain passes in Alsace, which the French auto ambulances are unable to cross, and over which wounded soldiers were formerly carried on muleback. They have been able to reduce the duration of the journey of the wounded between the dressing stations and the hospitals from 4 or 5 hours to less than 1, at the same time substituting transport in a comfortable springed vehicle for the agony of transport in the mule litters. 2 of the men in this section have already received the Croix de Guerre for special acts of valor. We have another section of ambulances attached to an American Army field hospital of 30 tents, which is also a branch of the American Ambulance Hospital made available to the French Army by generous American friends. This movable hospital is equipped to care for 140 wounded, and the whole installation of ward tents, officers and nurses' tents, operating tents, mess tents, etc., can be mounted by our men or demounted and packed on motor trucks ready for transportation in less than 3 hours. It is destined to be of great service in the devastated regions when the French army begins its advance. Finally, we have a section of ambulances in Lorraine, to which has been entrusted exclusively the service of carrying the wounded in the much fought-over region around Bois-le-Pretre. This section alone has carried on the average about 7,500 wounded per month. The men work continually within range of the German shells and are almost daily under German fire. The section as a whole and their leader have received honorable mention in official dispatches and have been given the Croix de Guerre. The daily life and activities of the men of this section are sketched by one of its members in the following personal letters which, while written without any thought of publication, are now privately printed in order that those generous Americans on the other side of the Atlantic who are making this chivalrous work possible may more truly appreciate its value and efficiency. From this unconscious story, one gets an impression of the devoted service which young Americans are rendering in France, and of the way in which they are reducing the agony and saving the lives of wounded French soldiers. One sees, too, how deeply this service is appreciated, and how through it the old friendship which has existed between France and the United States since the very beginning of our national history is being quickened and rejuvenated. Happy are all free peoples, too strong to be dispossessed, but blessed are those among nations who dare to be strong for the rest. A. Piet Andrew, September 6, 1915. Some of the section at Pont-à-Mousson. Lord, thy most pointed pleasure take, and stab my spirit broad awake. Stevenson. Ambulance number 10. Personal letters from the front. American Ambulance, June 17th. I came here, Pont-à-Mousson, last night after a 7 hours journey to Nancy from Paris. On the way I found much to interest me, as, if you will look on your map, you will see that the railway runs beside the River Marne, then the Meuse, and lastly the Moselle. An officer pointed out to me all the interesting places where the Germans advanced and then retreated in a hurry, or practically a rout, leaving everything behind, even to their flags, which I believe are now in London. After passing these and nearing Nancy, I saw what looked like a fleet of aeroplanes, and the officer explained to me that it was a flying Taube being shot at by the French. It looked like this. I am told that they rarely hit one. On arriving at Nancy, I was met by Salisbury, our section leader, and after a very good meal in the most beautiful little town you could hope to see, and where the Kaiser and 10,000 troops in dress parade were waiting on a hill close by to enter in state last October, we started by motor for Pont-à-Mousson. Some 15 kilometers farther on, our lights were put out, and we then entered the region under shell fire. It was a funny feeling listening to my conductor talking about how this shell and that shell hit here and there, and all along the route we passed torn-up trees, houses, and roads. At last we came to Pont-à-Mousson, a dear little village with about 8,000 inhabitants, and felt our way, so to speak, in the darkness and silence, to the barracks which are now the headquarters of the ambulance. I found that there were about 20 cars and 22 men here, the latter all enthusiastic about their work and the help the section were giving the French. The day before I arrived, a shell hit the house next door, and on first sight one would think it was the barracks itself which had been hit. These huge, high-explosive shells are sent into the town every 2 or 3 days, and everywhere one sees masses of brick and stone, all that remains of houses struck. The Germans have bombarded the town over 110 times. After being introduced to the boys, I went to my room, which is some 160 meters up the road, nearer the trenches, but safer for all that. Here I found I was to share the house with another man, Schroeder by name, a Hollander and a very nice fellow, who has already lost one brother and has had another wounded in the French army. My bedroom is a quite typical French peasant room, very comfortable, and I felt grateful to know that I was to have a bed and not straw to sleep on. I went to sleep there my first night in comparative quietness, only hearing now and then a crack of a musket, which in peacetime one would think was merely a backfire of some motor. In the morning I woke at 6 and went to breakfast in our barracks, which is always served at 7 o'clock. Walking out of my front door, I came into the main street. To the left is the way to the town and the barracks. To the right, the road goes straight on, an avenue of trees. My friend or housemate pointed out, about 500 meters away, what looked like a fallen tree across the road. Imagine my feelings when he told me that they were the French trenches. To the right and left of this avenue are hills, and on the left runs the river Moselle. On the ridge of hills on the right, one sees a brown line. These are the German trenches, and walking down the road to breakfast, one gets the knowledge that a first-class rifle shot could pick one off. After breakfast, I was asked by one of the men, Roeder, if I would like to look about the place, and I jumped at the invitation. We got into a Ford ambulance. No one can realize the excellence of the Ford for this purpose until he has seen what they can do. And we started on a tour, or petite promenade, as an officer told us we were doing. Pont-à-Mousson was in the hands of the Germans for 5 days, and our headquarters were the German officers' headquarters. The French partially blew up the bridge which crosses the Moselle at this most picturesque point, and for the last 5 days the Germans have been bombarding it, attempting in their turn to destroy it. Many of the houses round it seem to have been hit, and the 2 places where shells have taken most effect are on the bridge the French have repaired with wood. The boys tell me it is a wonderful sight to see the water rising like a geyser when the shells hit it in the river. To show how careless the few remaining peasants are, directly the Germans have, apparently, ceased firing, they get into boats to pick up the fish killed in hundreds by the concussion. We left the river, where we could be clearly seen by the Germans entrenched some 1,000 meters away, and I confess I sighed in relief, for it is difficult to accustom oneself immediately to the possibility of receiving a bullet in one's head or a shell in one's stomach. We then went through the town, everywhere being told stories of how, on such and such a day last week, 5 men were killed there, and 3 wounded here, etc. All the houses are left open, and one can walk into any doorway that looks interesting and do a tour of inspection. We left Pont-à-Mousson and started up the hill to our first Place de Secours. X, you will see it on your map, some 3 kilometers from Pont-à-Mousson. Rhoda, as we sped on, carefully explained that I was never to drive along this particular road, but was to take a back way, as the commandant had forbidden anyone to use this route, which was in full view of the German artillery and trenches. If he could have realized how I felt, he would have taken me by the back way that time, too. On the other side of the hill on our right extended the famous Bois le Prêtre, but it is no longer a wood. It is just a wilderness with a few brown stumps sticking up. "Would you like to go into the bois?" I was asked. I felt I had been in as much danger as I was likely to get into, so I said yes, and we turned to the left and mounted a steep hill and entered it. Here the birds were singing, and all was green and beautiful. It was a part where the artillery had not been, but one could see trench after trench deserted. Here was an officers' cemetery, a terribly sad sight. 600 officers' graves. Close by were also the graves of 1,800 soldiers. The little cemetery was quite impressive on the side of this lovely green hill, with the great trees all around and the little plain wood crosses at each grave. As we waited, a broken-down horse appeared with a cartload of what looked like old clothes. Les Morts. I had never seen a dead body until that moment. It was a horrible awakening. 8 stiff, semi-detached, armless, trunkless, headless bodies. All men like ourselves, with people loving them, somewhere. All gone this way, because of what? I don't know. Do you? A grave had been dug 2 meters deep, large enough to hold 16, and then we were asked to group ourselves around the car to be taken pour souvenir. I managed to do it. I stood there by those dead men and tried to look as if it were a natural thing to do. I felt like being sick. Then one by one they were lowered into the grave, and when they were all laid out, the identification started to take place. The good boots were taken off, and if a coat was not too bloody or torn, it was kept. "Surely we must be going," I said. "No, no, not before we have shown you the dead in the fosse there." "Good God!" I cried. "I can't do that now." And I didn't. We returned to Pont-à-Mousson for lunch at 12 o'clock, and I felt a very different person, and wondered How I could have felt faint the week before on merely seeing the photographs of wounded in our Neuilly hospital. One becomes habitué, they tell me. I was then officially handed over the car I am to drive, and I began looking over all the parts, as we have to do everything for ourselves here. Bridge over Moselle at Pont-à-Mousson. Trench work. Soldiers' graves at Bois-le-Prêtre. Saturday. It hardly seems possible that we are so close to the German trenches. Fair food, even hot water, wonderful moonlight nights, and a comfortable bed. Every other night we have to sleep in barracks to be on duty any moment, and so we sleep on straw and don't undress. Every fourth night we are on duty all night and go to X, and stay there in the car, taking wounded to the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd base hospitals. Thursday was my baptism of fire, for we had a great artillery duel, and it was very interesting, though not at all quieting, to hear the big guns fired and shells exploded over our heads. About 6 o'clock it stopped, and we went in to dinner. Afterward, another boy, Barclay, went for a walk with me, and we stopped to talk to 2 peasant girls who still remained in the town. "Come in and have some strawberries," they invited. And the way these girls offered us all the little luxuries their house could afford showed us how respected the American ambulance is by the peasants as well as the officers. "Do you fence?" one of them asked. "Yes, a little," I answered, and foils were brought out and we started in. The girl fenced well, but I managed to remember a little of what I once knew, when suddenly I heard a man's voice say in French, well done, give me the foils, my daughter, quick." And I was introduced to a fine old soldier who had fought in the campaign of 1870. We saluted and started again, but here I soon realized the touch of a master, and although I got in a few hits, I was easily beaten, and felt a little downcast. "But my husband is a professor of fencing for 40 years, observed Madame. I retired to bed, feeling that, though beaten, I might have many happy games in the evening at fencing with the vieux maître. Yesterday I took out my ambulance alone, and carried 8 wounded for the first time. I am now gradually slipping into my place, and the sense of strangeness is passing off. June 19th. To continue from where I left off, I am now on duty at the Bureau, our headquarters here. Last night, as I was finishing my dinner, I was told to go to F to fetch a contagious case and take it to the train. Sunday. I was suddenly interrupted by being called to fetch the wounded from X, and I am just back. My roommate offered to come with me to get the contagious case, which proved, fortunately, to be only measles, and we started off on what I thought then one of the most amazing trips of my life. Turning suddenly to the left from the main road, I drove our little Ford 3 kilometers along the road, which was in full view of the Germans and which had been the death place of many passers-by. Then turning left again, we drove slowly to a village so full of soldiers that it seemed impossible so many could even find shelter. A quick turn to the right, up, 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 first speed, along a very narrow road with just room for the car. On both sides were stuck up cut tree branches to make the Germans think there was no road. Up we went through another tiny hill village full of artillery, and on every side underground dugouts where they all live, trees blown down, branches stuck here and there to look like trees, and at last we reached the top. The water in the radiator was boiling, so we stopped, walked a bit in the most beautiful woods, and picked flowers and wild strawberries to the tune of birds and distant cannon. In this wood are heavy naval guns, but from where and how they were ever taken there is a puzzle. On we went through more woods until we were stopped by a sentry, who directed us still further, and then I saw what was the most dreamlike spectacle I ever beheld. The thick woods teemed with soldiers, and dotted through the forest were little huts, very low, where they live, thousands of them, pathways starting every 20 yards to some new wood village. We heard music, and on reaching our destination were invited to inspect these quaint habitations. We walked down a path past hut after hut, and then suddenly the wood opened out and we came to a kind of amphitheatre, and my friend and I were conducted to fauteuils, so to speak, and we listened after much handshaking and Vive l'Amérique, Vive l'Angleterre, and Camarades, etc., to a band of 3, banjo, violin, and dulcimer. As I write, a shell has just exploded nearby. I jump to see where, about 200 yards away, and the smoke is slowly clearing. We soon left our friends and took our contagious case to the station. After passing through wonderful valleys, hills, woods, and plains, we returned home pretty tired, wondering how such atrocities could be taking place in such a perfect country. We go regularly to Aix to get our blessés, and for 2 out of the 6 kilometers we are exposed to German view, and the whole of the way, of course, to shell fire. On my first arrival at this little mountain village, I was horrified to see 2 people lying dead in the road in huge pools of blood. 6 German 150s had been suddenly launched into the village, which is full of soldiers, and killed 6 soldiers and wounded some 30. 3 of the 6 shots had landed actually in the road itself. 2 of our ambulances were in the street at the time, and only chance spared them. I asked where the shells had struck, and my stretcher-bearer looked around for a moment, and then pointed under my own car, and there was a hole some 9 inches deep and 2 feet wide. It made me feel rather rotten, I must say. Only 5 minutes before, and it might happen again at any moment. I took down 3 couchés, as the lying down ones are called, and had to pass in front of a battery of 75s, which fired as I passed and gave me a shaky knee feeling, I can tell you. Then backward and forward for 2 hours, carrying more wounded, and to add to the excitement, it rained so hard that I was thankful I had bought myself 2 uniforms and could change. Today is Sunday, and after a rather uncomfortable night in my clothes and a snatchy sleep, I have a day off. Salisbury, our section leader, asked me to go with him to Toul, and I went for what proved to be a wonderful drive through sleeping villages and semi-tilled land and woods and valleys. Toul is one of the most fortified towns in France, and as we approached we saw trench after trench and wire entanglements, etc. The Germans, however, will never advance so far, I think. We stopped at the aeroplane sheds, where we picked up a captain, Australian, and with him entered Toul, a quiet, sleeping town with a lovely church. Returning, we were taken over the sheds and saw a large quantity of biplanes and monoplanes. I am now waiting to be taken up into the trenches, but the bombardment I spoke of earlier has continued so heavily that I doubt if we shall get up to them after all. The whole section here does real work night and day, amidst great hardships and no small danger, and the French appreciation is very apparent. German prisoners say that the Germans intend utterly demolishing Pont-à-Mousson if they have to retire any more, but it would take about 250,000 shells to do it, and I doubt if it is worth their while. If anyone can imagine the feeling of a peaceful man who suddenly hears a gun fired and a shell whistling overhead, followed by the explosion, and then vice versa by the enemy, he will perhaps sympathize with the disagreeable sensation I experienced when I first heard it happen. However, for 5 days it has gone on constantly, and soon I shall become accustomed. Putting in upper stretcher. Loading an ambulance.